Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're tuning us in. Welcome once again to another edition of B&B Hockey Talk. I'm Aaron Bloxel with my co-host Matthew Balzer. Today's going to be a great day. A nice, beautiful, sunny Monday here in the Vancouver area. July the 23rd, as we continue our 31 teams in 31 days. But before we do that, there was some significant signings throughout the weekend, as well as today. Is at least 5 of them that we're going to touch on before we jump into potential lineups of the Detroit Red Wings. So, Matthew, what do you got for us?
All right. So as I posted yesterday, two of the big, bright young defensemen in the NHL, Matt Dumba, got a 5-year extension with worth $30 million. Between him and Suter, they're their big two defensemen. He had a 50-point season last year, which he just continues to get better and better as each year goes along. And then Jacob Trouba and the Winnipeg Jets, they had to get an arbitrator to get a deal done, and it ended up being a 1-year, $5.5 million. This isn't the first time that the Jets and Trouba have gone at it for contract negotiations. I think Trouba was asking for $7 million, and the Winnipeg Jets were only asking for $4 million. So I think after next year he's still an RFA, but I think after that he'll be an unrestricted free agent.
I did hear that even though he was awarded that as of about an hour ago, he still has not signed it. But he had about 48 hours to officially sign it. Otherwise, if they don't come up with a deal, he becomes a UFA. So that's going to be interesting to watch because, like you said, it is the second time he's had a dispute with that team. I think last time I heard he was asking $8 million a season. This time he was asking $7 million. It's pretty crazy. But sorry to cut you off there, but let's continue.
Oh yeah, no worries. And the same thing with Trouba with that is that he's only played one full NHL season through like the 4 or 5 years that he's played. So he's had injury problems. So it's tough when he's when he's playing. He's one of their best defensemen. I think I put him as their second best defenseman behind Bufflin. But yeah, you need the guy in the lineup because he only played like 55 games in the regular season last year. And then the Jets also locked up Chris Tanev's brother, Brandon Tanev, to a 1-year, $1.15 million contract. He really broke through in the playoffs, especially on that fourth line. He had 4 goals and 6 points in 17 games on that fourth line. And hopefully he can continue to develop and get some more ice time and produce more. And just coming in about like a half hour ago, the New York Islanders re-signed Brock Nelson to a 1-year, $4.25 million deal. A little bit overpaying for him. I think he only had 19 goals and 35 points last year, which was a step down from his year before. But with Tavares gone, he has the potential to get that second line role behind Barzal between him and Valtteri Filppula, who they brought in. So he could potentially get more ice time and play with some better line mates. And then the Vegas Golden Knights re-signed William Carrier to a 2-year deal worth $725K. During the season, he only played about half the season. He was in and out of the lineup. But before he got injured in the playoffs, he was one of their big physical presences on that fourth line. It'd be interesting to see how much playing time he does get with Ryan Reeves being re-signed to that big, huge 2-year contract. I think that's over like $2 million. It's stupid to pay that guy that much money. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much ice time he gets.
All right. Well, let's get into our preview of the Detroit Red Wings. They've got a lot of youth coming into their lineup, a lot of prospects. But we've noticed a lot of aging veterans as well. So why don't you start us off with the forwards?
All right. So just to let everybody know, this will be without like any of their top prospects that could potentially be in the lineup. We won't be counting that. As the first line, I have as Gustav Nyquist, Henrik Zetterberg, and Anthony Mantha. Zetterberg will be interesting to see with his health. Like reports coming out, it's like if he will or will not play this year, though he should play, but with a bad back and the salary that he's making for like these last 3 years as it goes down, it'll be interesting to see how much longer he continues. Nyquist had a disappointing year last year, only 21 goals and 40 points, but which is disappointing because earlier in his career, it looked like he was really going to break out and be a 60, 70-point player, and he sort of just stuck right in that 40, 50-point range. The second line I have is Andreas Anthony, Dylan Larkin, and Thomas Vanek. Canuck fans know Thomas Vanek had actually a really good year in Vancouver, between Vancouver and Columbus. And just as myself, and I think a lot of other Canuck fans, when the Canucks first signed Vanek, everyone was just like, why are we doing this? This guy's going to take ice time away from Brock Besser. But I think really started to appreciate his game with some of the dumb things that he would do every once in a while. But he actually ended up being a really smart player. And I really like that sign. And with Dylan Larkin, he really bounced back from the sophomore slump. And he only had like 32 points the year before. But this year he bounced back with 63 points for the year. And with Anthony Theo and Larkin, if they play together, those are two of the fastest guys in the NHL. And I think that would really work with Vanek patrolling around, just getting into his spot and letting those guys set him up. The third line I have is Tyler Bertuzzi, Franz Nielsen, and Justin Abdelkader. Nielsen was one of their big signings a few years ago. He's sort of been like in that 35 to 50 point range over his career, but he's still making a lot of money. I think he's like over like $5 million, which for what he's producing hasn't exactly worked out for what they have. And then Abdelkader, well, he's still got that long contract that which he's not worth whatsoever. Bertuzzi's an intriguing name, though. I think he had 24 points in 48 games, and he is a guy that could potentially break out or move into a top six role potentially. And then the fourth line I have is Darren Helm, Luke Glendening, and Martin Ferk. Ferk finally got some playing time this year with the Red Wings, former first-round pick. It'll be interesting to see how they use him because Blashill, sometimes he would play him a lot, and other times he'd barely get any ice time at all. So it'll be interesting to see from there. And then as extra forwards, I have Luke Wachowski, who was a defenseman transferred to a forward, and is basically a guy that they would just throw in just to fight somebody. I think as last year he got like a 10-game suspension or whatever for fighting somebody off the bench. And there's a couple other guys. Yevgeny Svechnikov, who we'll touch on later, and Matt Pumpel, who is a guy they got from a trade with the New York Rangers last year, and is sort of like on his last gasp if he can get into an NHL lineup. He's been about a point-a-game player in the American League, but he's one of those guys sort of like a Reed Boucher with the Canucks, where he can produce in the American League but hasn't shown that he consistently produce in the NHL.
Excellent. I do have another guy as a depth guy, Wade Megan. May or may not make the team, but definitely somebody that will play in Grand Rapids to start the season. They do have a lot of young guys. We're going to touch on some that are prospects that we both believe will probably make this Detroit Red Wings team this year. They do have salary issues, which we'll touch on in a little bit, but one of the salaries is extra forward Johan Franzen. It's a shame that he just way too many concussions in his career. He's definitely not going to be back, but they still are paying for him. You touched on Franz Nielsen a little bit. I remember when he was playing with the New York Islanders, he was a 50, 60-point guy, number 2 center behind John Tavares there, and he just really hasn't done it in Detroit. So it's going to be interesting to see that group, see if they're healthy or not. But to me, it's one of the weaker forward groups that we've come across so far since starting our 31-team preview. It's going to be definitely interesting to see how the Red Wings do this year. They have a pretty good defense as far as veteran core go. Let's touch on that for a sec. So I've got Nick Cronwell, Mike Green, then Danny DeKaiser with Trevor Daley, Jonathan Erickson with Nick Jensen. And those 6 guys there, all veterans of the league, all getting up there in age. Some of them are carrying some crazy contracts. Again, we'll touch on that towards the end of the show. Detroit really doesn't have a lot of cap space, and that's holding them back a little bit. But they do have a couple of prospects that I think are going to really push for spots on this team. So why don't we jump right into that? Unless do you have anything you want to add about the defense before we jump into the prospects? Actually, touch on the defense and let's go through the goaltending, and then we'll get to the prospects.
The thing is, we'll touch it sort of after the prospects. A lot of the cap problems they have, especially with the contracts they have for their defensemen. I did like the bringing back of Mike Green, though I believe I think it was the neck injury that ended his season last year. It'll be interesting to see how he's recovered and if he can get back to that 40-point range. But even bringing him back is only on a 2-year contract. I think that was good. The goaltenders, it was Jimmy Howard and Jonathan Bernier. Bernier they brought in on a 3-year contract with a $3 million cap hit. Bernier actually did have a pretty decent year in Colorado. I think he helped Colorado go like on a 9-10 game win streak or something like that, and he was a huge part of that. When Varlamov got hurt. And Howard is somewhat of a little bit of an underrated goalie, I think. But with a bad team in front of him over the past few years, it's sort of tough on him to get going. But he out-battled Peter Mrazek last year with them trading him away. So he's still that veteran presence back there. And then they brought in Harry Sateri, who was with the Florida Panthers last year as their third stringer. And he showed that he could play with when Luongo and James Reimer were both hurt, that he actually went on a pretty good stretch. So if any of those goalies get hurt, he's proven that he can do it in the NHL.
I like their goaltending. I think it is definitely a veteran presence back there to go along with the veterans on defense. I do worry, though, if they get any injuries for any amount of major time, that they're going to be in some big trouble with that depth, and with the forwards that they have, I think they have some holes that they definitely need to fill. So let's get into some of the prospects. I wanted to touch on a few, and then we'll get you to go through as they have some great first-round draft picks that are coming up that are getting close to making the step into the NHL. They also have a lot of second and third round and other draft picks that are slowly getting into depth players. So they're doing a lot of developing right now. They're a team to watch for, I think, in 3, 4, 5 years to see where this group's at. But first of all, I'm going to touch on forward prospect that they drafted first overall this year. It was their first round pick this year, so 6th overall. They also had a late first rounder. But Philip Zadina, I definitely think this guy's flashy enough. I mean, he dropped in midseason ranking. He was about number 2 as far as the prospects go. He dropped all the way to 6 when draft day came. And I have a feeling he's going to make the opening day spot for Detroit and definitely help fill some of their offensive holes. I don't know a lot about Joe Veleno, but I know maybe I'll get you to touch on him when the time comes. That was their second first-round pick this year. One of the guys I think on defense that's going to make this team is Joe Hicketts, who's from Victoria. Last year in Grand Rapids, he played 67 games, had 12 points. Not an offensive guy, but a really good stay-at-home defenseman. Played for Team Canada a few years ago in the World Juniors. Very mobile, very good checker. I could see him as a number 7 or a number 8 defenseman this year to start off the season. And then we've got first-round pick from 2016, giant defenseman Dennis Cholowski, who I saw play for the Chilliwack Chiefs a few years ago. Played for ended up in the WHL last year with the Portland Winterhawks. Played 69 games and had 66 points as a defenseman. So not only is he big, he can put up some offensive numbers. I also believe he has a shot at making this team this year. It's going to be interesting to see, just because he's NHL body with good hands, and obviously can put up a lot of points. So we're going to also touch on, you already mentioned a guy named Evgeny Svechnikov. He was their first-round pick from 2015. Probably going to make the team as a depth forward or start the season in Grand Rapids. But last year in Grand Rapids, he had 23 points in 57 games. And I can see him potentially getting on as the third or fourth line player. But I can also see him in the AHL to start the year and be one of the first call-ups guarding any injuries. One of my favorite prospects as well is another big man up the middle, Michael Rasmussen, who played for Tri-Cities in the WHL last year. He was their 2017 first-round draft pick, 47 games and 59 points. Took a little bit of a dip last year, ran into some injuries, but with a big body like that, he's going to be NHL ready as well. I saw one website had him listed as their third-line center, assuming that they put Larkin on the wing. And that is possible. I mean, he reminds me of a Martin Hansel, and very good on draws, very good because of his size all over the ice. And then lastly, on my prospects list is a defenseman named Gustav Lindstrom. He was their second-round pick in 2017. Played in the SHL last year for Frölunda out of Sweden. Didn't put up a lot of points, but he had 14 points in 39 games. And they're really high on this guy, thinking that he's going to be a steady NHL 3-4 defenseman in years to come. So that's some of my prospects. I know you've got a bunch to cover as well, so I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Yeah, so just to touch on Svechnikov as well. It will be interesting because even though he only had 23 points, it will be interesting because the year before he actually had a really good offensive year, I think over like 50 points or something like that. So he had a bit of a step down, but with injuries as well. It will be interesting to see if he can get that offensive spark like his younger brother with Carolina will have this year. It'll be interesting to see how things go. Yeah, so another second-round pick that they had this year was defenseman Jared McIsaac. Had 47 points in 65 games for Halifax in the Q. He was a guy that could potentially have gone in the first round, but he was sort of like in that clump of players that just missed out on the first round and went high in the second round of this year's draft. Joe Velino, who you mentioned, their centerman, who had 79 points in 64 games in the Q. I think he is one of the more underrated centermen, and especially with the lack of depth of young centers in their organization outside of Rasmussen. He could potentially down the road could turn out into a good player. So they have a lot of second-round picks. So a few guys, you mentioned Lindstrom, but they have another guy, Philippe Hronek, who had a really good year in the American League. He had 11 goals and 39 points in only 67 games, and another offensive defenseman. Another guy is Giovanni Smith, another second-round pick. He had 30 points in 46 games in the OHL, but he had 11 goals and 18 points in the playoffs. In 18 games. So he showed he could take his game to another level in the playoffs. And another centerman that they called up late, Dominic Turgeon. He had 32 points in 69 games in the American League. Could potentially end up being a fourth-line center or something like that, and one of the call-ups for this year.
We were going through that list of prospects because there's a lot more that they still have. A lot of draft picks that they have, and we couldn't get over how many ex-NHL players that had sons that were on in this organization, with Jake Chelios on defense. You mentioned Turgeon already, who's Pierre Turgeon's son. We also saw Doug Gilmour's son on the list. So they have a lot of prospects, and as we know in past history, Detroit's really good at developing players. So it'll be interesting to see what their transition is as they continue to age or have aging players that they need to continue to replace. So
Yeah,
Let's go ahead.
sorry. Just one other thing is that they don't really have a whole lot of goalie prospects, which is interesting. It's like the only guy I really wrote down was Jordan Van Podelberg, who I believe played for the Swiss at the World Juniors a few years ago. He played out in Davos this last year, but he's really the only knowable. I think they tried for Thomas McCollum in the first round a few years ago, but he didn't turn into anything. So with Howard and Bernier being veteran goalies, it'll be interesting to see who will be that next big goalie future in net with Mrazek gone.
I did see that they didn't have any big names, but they did have a lot of volume. I did see they had 6 prospects over the last few years that are at the goalie position. Whether they even sign them or not, it's another story. I mean, they're not playing in the AHL or obviously the NHL yet, but they do have a lot of prospects that they're looking at. They'll have a lot of work to do this summer to figure out their roster in both Detroit and Grand Rapids. And some of the problems that they're running into, we've touched on a little bit in the show already, and I'm going to get you to touch on it again, is their salary cap issues.
Yeah, so people talk about Ken Holland being a great GM, and which with the drafting and stuff, with the scouts that they have, he's done an excellent job. But over the past couple of years, he's handed out some pretty bad contracts, which have turned into the cap problems that they have now. So as I touched on, the Justin Abdelkader, he still has 5 more years at $4.25 million, and he only had 35 points in 75 games last year. For a guy that's around 30 years old and is just, with the way the type of player he is more of a banger, hits guys and chips in a little bit. It's not a good contract whatsoever. Danny DeKeyser, who they gave a huge contract out for no apparent reason since he was still a restricted free agent. He still has 4 years at $5 million. And he only had 6 goals and 12 points last year. So for a guy that you're paying $5 million and isn't producing much offense whatsoever, that was a bad contract. And Jonathan Ericsson, who I think is the guy that they would try to move on their back end, he still has 2 years at $4.25 million. Would be the guy that they would try to move because they still have to re-sign Dylan Larkin, and they only have just over $2.8 million left in cap space. And Larkin's going to want around $5-6 million at least. And 2 buyouts that they had, Stephen Weiss, for those who remember him playing with the Florida Panthers and then getting a big contract with Detroit. He still has, with his buyout, he's still counting against $1.67 million for the next 3 years against the cap. And then they bought out Xavier Ouellet, who is one of their draft picks, and he'll be ranging between 160 to 215K for the next 2 years against the cap, which is So with signing Larkin or whatever, with Franson not being able to go on long-term injured reserve until the start of the season, that would free up close to another $4 million, but that means Larkin couldn't attend training camp or anything, sort of like they had with Anthony Ciu last year, who held out for contract reasons, and with Detroit having cap problems as well last year. So it will be interesting. And then was the Zetterberg situation with his cap hit at just over $6 million, but this year he's only making $3.35 million, and then the last 2 years he's only making $1 million each. So a guy that's going to be 38 in October with a bad back as well, because I think the second half of the season all he did was play games. He didn't practice at all. It will be interesting to see if you get a Marian Hossa like situation where they'll find some way that he can sort of retire, sort of thing, while not having any repercussions against the cap.
Maybe they will reunite Zetterberg with Pavel Datsyuk and Marian Hossa in Arizona, right? They finished last year with 73 points, which was near the bottom of the Western Conference. I see them kind of hovering around the 75-point mark again this year. I don't see them drastically improving over that. Where do you see them?
Yeah, so I have them battling out with Montreal, Buffalo, and Ottawa for those bottom four spots in the East. Yeah, it's like they got a few names here and there up front, but not a whole lot for the time being. As soon as they get some more offense coming from their defense and continuing to get younger, then a few years down the road, potentially they could be back in that playoff race, which is sort of weird to think because it's just like they had that huge streak of making the playoffs for 20-something plus years. So it'll be good for Detroit to finally get back in the playoffs and into that conversation again.
Somewhere Nicholas Lidstrom is smiling since that streak was around the time he started and ended around the time he retired. And it was an incredible streak, but they're definitely they're not the same team they used to be. I know there's a lot of people that are still big Detroit Red Wing fans, but they have a little bit of a hill to climb. They're like the Canucks. They're retooling, they're rebuilding, and they're restocking with prospects. So, well, that pretty much wraps up our show for today. So, hit the like button, hit the share button, comment below on what you liked about today's show. And again, if you share our broadcast, we're going to be giving you a shout out in our next broadcast. This is B&B Hockey Talk. Thanks again so much for tuning us in, as this is Aaron Bloxall and Matthew Balzer signing off. We'll see you tomorrow as our 31 teams in 31 days continues with the Edmonton Oilers. Should be exciting.